Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the anime film Appleseed. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Appleseed series, it is worth noting that it began as a manga series from Shirow Masamune, who is best known for his franchise Ghost in the Shell. And I do think it's fair to say that behind Ghost in the Shell, Appleseed is his second most popular franchise. Now, Appleseed did actually see an anime incarnation, which was released in 1988 as an OVA, and I actually reviewed it pretty recently. But it wouldn't be for another 16 years that a new animated incarnation of the franchise would come out, and that was the 2004 film Appleseed. Now, Appleseed was quite notable for one thing, and one thing in particular, and that was the fact that it was a movie that was done in CGI. And this was something that a lot of people hadn't seen too much of. Now, that's not to say that this was the first CG anime film. It actually wasn't. The very first was, I believe, a movie called Alice. There have been a couple of others, but this was the one that kind of really brought the idea of making CGI anime to the forefront. And so, of course, the question is, as always, is Appleseed any good? And that's what I'm going to be discussing today. So let's get started. So what is the story of Appleseed? Appleseed takes place in the aftermath of World War III, and our main character is Duna Newt, who is still fighting for survival in an urban environment. After a combat situation at the beginning of the film, she is found and rescued by Hitomi. Hitomi comes from a place called Olympus, which is a new city that has been established as a haven for humans, and has seen a new form of humans develop called bioroids. Bioroids are artificial humans who have been developed in order to govern Olympus. They basically control the government and run the city, and when Duna Newt arrives in Olympus, she actually encounters a friend of hers called Briareos. Now, Briareos was injured and has undergone surgery and has become a cyborg. And as you might imagine, Duna finds the situation to be a little confusing. She has to adapt to this new lifestyle, and ultimately she must help to protect the city, and that's how Appleseed begins. Now, the story of Appleseed is a bit mixed in many ways. On one hand, I think it does a much better job establishing the setting and the characters than the 1988 OVA. We do actually get an explanation of what the term Appleseed means, and we get some very interesting backstory for a lot of the characters, in particular Duna herself. On the other hand, a lot of the side characters are quite uninteresting or uninspired. In particular, one thing I was quite disappointed at in this movie is that Hitomi, who is a bioroid, has a much weaker personality than she did in the 1988 OVA film. There are also some pretty strange story choices. In particular, there's something that happens near the end, just before the climax of the film, where a certain character kind of goes back on what they had been fighting for up to that point. It's pretty much handled off screen, and I just found it very jarring, and so I did find that to be a little bit disappointing. But overall, I would argue that the characters and story is better handled here than in the 1988 OVA film, and it is ultimately enjoyable. There's some very nice action sequences, which I'll talk about more when we get to the animation. So while I wouldn't be saying that the story itself is particularly great, I do think it does enough to serve the purpose of the film, and to help bond viewers with Duna Newt and Briareos, who I do have to say are two pretty likable characters. Now we get to the really interesting part of this film, which is the animation itself. Now, as I mentioned before, this film is in CGI, and the effects of this CGI can be very, very mixed. On one hand, there are some very nice action sequences, and I do think quite a few of these action sequences work quite well, and also the background to a lot of the film actually looks quite nice in terms of its level of detail, in terms of its lighting. Where we start running into problems is with the characters themselves. Now, the film goes for a cel-shaded look, and I do believe that that was the correct choice. However, a big problem with this film, I think, is actually the lighting. If you take a look at the characters, quite often the lighting looks quite bizarre when it comes to interacting with the characters themselves. They also move in a very awkward manner, which really took me out of the film. And one thing that quite baffles me is when I'm looking at how people received the film at the time, in general, people consider this film to be a technical marvel, which is a bit strange to me. Now, when I've talked to other people about it, you know, they say, oh, it was 2004, CGI was new, etc., etc. But keep in mind that CG films have been coming out for 9 years at this point, ever since the Toy Story in 1995. So while I guess there was a little bit of leeway given that this was only about like the third or fourth CGI anime film produced in Japan, I don't think that excuses how rough a lot of the animation and the lighting is in this film. And ultimately, I don't think it holds up that well visually, even if quite a few of the action sequences are quite nice and enjoyable. Following that, we have the music. The music for this film is pretty decent. It's definitely a bit more memorable than the 1988 incarnation. And I did find a lot of the music that was being played during those action sequences to be quite exciting. But beyond the soundtrack that plays during the action sequences, the rest of the music is simply average. To be completely honest, I hardly remember any of the music outside of the action sequences, which speaks to how average the soundtrack was, in that it didn't really stand out to me in a good or negative way. Now, with regards to the voice acting, now if I'm correct, I do believe I heard that there was an English dub produced by Sentai Filmworks when they acquired the rights to this film. But I believe that the edition that I have only contains the Japanese and the first English dub that was produced for the film. And I actually chose to watch this film in the English, and there was a little bit of a problem with that. So the voice acting itself, the English voice acting, is pretty decent.
Do you have any idea who attacked me out there?
No.
I wouldn't call it particularly great, but it does serve its purpose. I think the problem though, and this is a problem that I've noticed with a lot of CGI anime productions, is that it's much harder to dub over the animation when it's in CGI than typical hand-drawn anime, and I think that has to do with the more detailed mouth movements. So while watching this film, there are quite a few sections where you can tell that the lips are moving differently to the sounds that are being produced in English.
The question is why? Who's behind this?
And so while I chose to watch the rest of the Appleseed franchise in English still, through no fault of the actors themselves, I would probably recommend that you watch this film in Japanese, simply due to the fact that there would be better lip sync. In regards to how it was released, this edition that I have here was released by Optimum, and it's a pretty decent release. As I mentioned before, it's got the first English dub and the Japanese. This DVD was released before the second English dub was produced, so they couldn't possibly have that. The presentation of the film itself is pretty decent, and there are some decent extras. One extra that I found quite surprising that was included in this release was a commentary from the director and producer of this film, because usually you don't see Japanese commentaries brought over here and subtitled. I thought that was quite a nice extra to include in this release. And of course there's some behind the scenes about the animation, about doing the production of the animation, etc, etc, and that is interesting enough stuff to include as well. So it's definitely a decent enough release of this film. I do believe that the American Blu-ray contains more than this, and of course I would recommend that if you're in America and want to pick this film up, that you would go with the Blu-ray edition. But for those of you over here, this DVD will actually serve pretty well as well. So in conclusion, what are my thoughts on Appleseed? Appleseed is a decent enough film. I do confess that I actually like it a little bit more than the 1988 OVA. I think it does a better job with the characters, with establishing the setting and the themes. There are definitely some strange story decisions that they make, many of which don't work in the film's favour, but I did ultimately enjoy the story itself. The animation has not held up well. It was an interesting experiment on their part, but ultimately outside of the action sequences, it does not work. And I think if you're going to watch this film today, I think it's at its most interesting when you look at it as a product of its time, of an early anime CGI film, and how it has served as a precursor to many other CGI anime films. So if you're a fan of the Appleseed franchise, if you're a fan of Shirow Masamune, or you're looking for a decent action CGI film, then I'd ultimately recommend Appleseed. So that was my review of Appleseed from 2004. Let me know your own thoughts on Appleseed. Did you like this film? Did you dislike this film? If so, why? What are your thoughts on the animation of this film? Do you really think that it was a technical marvel in 2004, or do you think it was outdated even at the time? And of course, if you have any other additional information about anime CGI films, about Appleseed, about Shirow Masamune, please leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon and Right Stuf affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase an anime or manga through those affiliate links, not only are you supporting me, not only are you supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the anime and manga industry. So I'd highly encourage you to purchase your anime and manga through those affiliate links. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye bye.